And they made us go through the house and get everything that had an owl or a frog on it. Pictures, pillows, pieces of art, whatever. They piled it in the middle of the living room. We all had to dance around it and pray and sing in tongues while they cast the devil out of these inanimate objects. And then they smashed them with hammers and a fireplace poker and just smashed it all.
Kendra Petty, thanks so much for coming back on to Talk Beliefs from your home on the West Coast of the USA. In our last interview, we talked about your memoir, I Can't Believe I'm Not Dead, a story partly about growing up in a homegrown cult and enduring seemingly unending abuses until you decided enough was enough and you struck out on your own. Well, we've both received quite a lot of positive feedback about that interview, with people asking if we could have you back on the show to go into even more detail about the church created by your mom and stepdad and how you survived its incredible demands. So how have you been doing, Kendra? Your early life was definitely a harrowing one, but people really do seem to appreciate the lessons you've been passing on.
Hi, Mark. So happy to be back. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Yes, I've received incredible feedback about my memoir, because my memoir is about my life story, but it's also about my healing process. So I share towards the end of the book a lot of the things that I did to heal. But the book has just been astounding. It's hit a couple of bestseller lists on Amazon. It won an award. And from that, I launched a public speaking platform and a public speaking company. So I'm doing public speaking around my story and my healing process. And actually yesterday, I had a very long conversation with a production company that produces a show for a streaming service that you watch on TV. So we're going to meet again next week. And so that's pretty exciting. Things are really just blossoming and opening up. So it's very exciting.
Before we dive into the depths of the cult that consumed your young life, could we just have an overview of what you cover in your memoir leading up to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I've lived a life of this cycle of trauma and tragedy, just continuous from my childhood, throughout my childhood into my adulthood. And it's some of it is very unbelievable. When I was a child, my mother, who is very mentally ill, she's still alive, but she's very mentally ill. She was very abusive, and she was always, it was really 911, hair on fire every day, walking on eggshells with her because of her mental illness, never knowing when she was going to melt down or explode, if you will. But when I was 8 years old and my older brother, who was my best friend, was 10, he was killed in a horrific accident in front of me while we were together. And that death left my mother, she fell into even a deeper madness, if you will. And my parents ended up getting divorced. My father left and my parents divorced. So I was left with my younger brother and my mother for a time. And then my mother remarried her best friend's husband. Her best friend died of cancer. And she married her best friend's husband. And all of a sudden, we had a new family. I had 2 new stepsisters and a new stepfather, and my brother and my mother and I. And we were all grieving. I was still grieving from my brother's death and my parents' divorce. My mother was grieving from the loss of her son, her husband, and her best friend. It all happened within a couple of years. And my stepfather and my new stepsisters were grieving from the loss of his wife and their mother. So when we came together, it was a bit chaotic because we were all just sort of an emotional mess. And looking back, I feel like in looking for comfort from their grief, my mother and my stepfather dove very, very, very deep and very dark into religion. A religion really that they started on their own. The church started in our house. My stepfather was the pastor, and it morphed into this extreme cult. And so I lived with them through that cult for about 6 years and left under just terrible circumstances. My mother was beating me one day when I was 18, and it was just a horrific beating, as most of them were. And I left and I moved in with my father for the rest of my senior year. And then I moved to New York City. And I was determined to leave behind all the trauma and tragedy that I had gone through in Oklahoma and start a whole new life for myself in New York City. And so I did. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college. I graduated and I started climbing the corporate ladder. I married a woman that, unbeknownst to me, had a hidden drug habit and was an alcoholic. And she was also very, very abusive. Very abusive. She broke my bones on a number of occasions. I have scars on my body from her abuse. One night I locked myself in the bathroom and called the police because I thought she was going to kill me. I literally thought I was going to die that night. That night she fractured my elbow and other injuries. So I had her arrested. And it took me about 6 years to get out of that relationship, just because I cared for her so much and kept thinking I could help her. And as it turns out, I couldn't. So I divorced her, and I really threw myself into my work because climbing the ladder was really my focus in my life. And so I just threw myself into my work even more. And I left the company that I'd been with for almost 15 years and joined a firm as the number 2 under the CEO. And I oversaw, they owned about 5 companies, and I oversaw a couple of those companies. And unbeknownst to me, I had joined a company that was involved in organized crime. And as those crimes and those illegal activities started revealing themselves to me, I started asking questions and pushing back, and things really went sideways for me at that work, and they got very dark and very scary and very bizarre. And then my employer tried to kill me. They put poisons in my home, in my office, in my car. I was unknowingly ingesting the poisons, inhaling them and breathing them in and wearing them on my clothes. And the poisons made me very, very, very sick for a very long time. And they led to a number of diseases, including Graves' disease, which is an incurable autoimmune disease. And I fought that disease for about 12 years, had trouble keeping it in remission. So we finally removed my thyroid, and it damaged my vocal cords in the process. I have about 12 permanent staples in my neck from the removal. And now I have a different kind of autoimmune, because when you don't have a thyroid, then you go into hypothyroidism. So working on, keeping that in check. But I also, 7.5 years after the poisoning, was diagnosed with cancer. Cancer does not run in my family. The gestation period for developing cancer when exposed to chemicals is 7 to 8 years. And I was diagnosed at 7.5 years. And I had no doubt when I was diagnosed that it was because of those poisons that I was exposed to for quite a while. So I've spent a long time trying to heal my body and focusing on, doctors and treatments and therapies to feel better and make sure cancer doesn't come back. And then about 6 years ago, I hit a wall. I hit a wall really hard, and I just thought, I cannot continue to live in this cycle of trauma and tragedy. I've got to figure out how to heal my mind and my heart and my soul. I focused on my body for so long, and I still do, but I really needed to heal the rest of me after all that I had been through. And so I had a concerted focus on learning and reading and digging in to different therapies to help me heal my heart and my mind. And it's been a long journey. I've done a lot of different therapies, but it's been incredibly healing. And part of that healing process was writing the book and writing my story down. And now I talk about my story. And so writing it for 3 years with a ghostwriter was very, very cathartic. Talking about it with her and then writing it and editing it was very cathartic. And now I spend time doing interviews such as this and others, and public speaking around my story and my healing process. And every time I talk about it, it's a little more healing. So it's just been an incredible process for me, and very dynamic.
Okay, let's go right back to the beginning. You grew up in Oklahoma with a Methodist father and a Baptist mother, but things really changed when your parents divorced. Isn't that right?
No, that's absolutely right. But to your point, I was born on a farm in Oklahoma. It's a family farm. It's still in our family. And we left the farm. My dad didn't want to continue farming into his adulthood. He was raised on the farm and farming. And so we left when I was very young and we moved to Lawton, Oklahoma, a couple of hours away. But we spent a lot of time on the farm. We were always back. We're still always back. We have family reunions every other year and spend time at the farm with the rest of our family. But we left and we moved around Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas until I was about 5 years old, and we settled in Lawton, Oklahoma, which is about half an hour from the Texas border. We were constantly together. We were very close, thick as thieves, always playing together and laughing, a lot of laughter and monkeying around. But it was very stressful in our household because, as I mentioned, my mother is very mentally ill. And so when we were outside and away from my mother, we had a lot of fun. But when we were around our mother, it was very difficult. It was just a very tumultuous time being around her. And after my brother died, it really sent my mother into the black abyss of depression, and it just facilitated worse mental illness, if you will. She's been diagnosed with a number of different things. She's now in a nursing home. She's older, but it was, it was really a lot of terror. I was afraid of my mother. I always tried to fly under the radar. I was not a rebellious or bad child. I was always afraid of her. But you never knew what was going to set her off or when she was going to get set off, but I guarantee she would. We would, if she got set off in the car, she got angry in the car and she was the passenger, we could be driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour or on a city street at 40 miles an hour, and she would open the door and try to jump out. And my dad would have to grab her and slam on the brakes and put all of us in danger. And sometimes she would get out of the car after he stopped and run away, and he'd have to go find her. It was just always so chaotic. She would scream and scream and scream for hours, and rage, throw things, break things, and beat me. And most of her beatings were directed at me, and I feel like it's because she blamed me for my brother's death. And I know I certainly blamed myself. And so I took her beatings as punishment for my brother's death. But when I was in fifth grade, my father left, and they divorced. And then my mother, as I mentioned, married her best friend's husband, and we became a family. And again, I think in looking back, in their grief, in both their griefs, they were looking for comfort and they were looking for answers. And that's when they dove just headfirst into religion and started a church in our home. And that church morphed into just a bizarre cult. And that church grew and grew and grew. And my stepfather was the pastor for a long time. And it grew until we rented a church and moved out of our house into a church. And then it grew again, and we rented a bigger church, and so on and so forth. And we eventually got so big that we could hire a full-time pastor, and my father stepped down as the pastor, and we had employed a pastor. But it was, there was a lot of cruel and sadistic things in that cult. All the interpretation of my parents, and mostly the Old Testament. It was a scary time, much scarier after my brother died, with my mother and her mental illness and her anger issues. And then when the cult started, it was just every day was God, the Bible, singing and praying in tongues, and every day was just focused on Bible study and going to church or Bible study at home and God. And there wasn't really a lot of anything else outside of that.
Those teenage years were a very difficult, abusive time for you, fueled by a homegrown cult religion that was very suffocating indeed. Kendra, what was day-to-day life like for you and your siblings during this period?
Very scary, both because of my mother's mental illness, but also because of the religion and the dominating effect that it had on all of our lives. It was very controlling. As I said, all God, all Bible, all the time. We weren't allowed to associate with anybody from outside the church. We weren't allowed to watch TV, listen to the radio, read magazines or newspapers, anything that was secular. We weren't allowed to do. There were beatings in the name of God. My stepfather managed a grocery store, and the wooden pallets that food comes in on, that's delivered on, my stepfather would break them apart, saw them into different sizes, one size for each child, and so they got smaller for the younger child. He would drill holes through them so the air could pass quicker, and they would line them up on the fireplace so that we, as a reminder, and none of us were bad kids. My older stepsister had mental illness, and so she was in and out of institutions just like my mother was. And she was a bit violent, and she would also beat me up and push me down the stairs. And so that was really the only time that any of us kids misbehaved, was when my sister couldn't control her anger. But they would line those paddles up on the fireplace, and if any of us misbehaved, they would use them. And my mother broke many of them, including all the other kids, on my back and my legs and my arms and my head. It didn't matter. When she was raging, she would use anything: belts, hangers, the end of the belt buckle side of my stepfather wore cowboy boots and big belt buckles, Oklahoma, and she beat me with the belt buckle side. And so it was just so much violence and anger in my home. I've never met anybody more angry than my mother. We also went to a Christian school because that's the closest thing that my mother could find for us. So in Christian school, we'd study the Bible, memorize scripture, pray, sing, have Bible study in school. Then we'd come home from school, do our homework, do a little cleaning around the house, and then we would have Bible study again, or we would have to be in our rooms for several hours reading the Bible, memorizing scripture, praying. And then when we would come together as a family or go to church, there was a lot of singing and dancing and praying in tongues, a lot of casting out of the devil's satanic panic, if you will. So people would come to the pastor or my stepfather before we hired the pastor, and they would lay their hands on them and heal them or cast the devil out of them. People would fall out on the ground and convulsing and crying and singing in tongues. Basically everything but the snakes. You've heard about those charismatic churches. It was very similar to that. But a lot of casting out the devil of inanimate objects, not just people. My mother was constantly, even in public, praying in tongues and under her breath, like at a grocery store or wherever we are, praying in tongues under her breath. It was rather embarrassing. And there were really strange, bizarre rituals that they would perform, kind of scary. And because they based a lot of things on the Old Testament, except for Revelations, they definitely believed in the world was ending any day now, and God was coming back, and the rapture was happening any minute. But a lot of their other beliefs were based on the Old Testament. So there was a scripture in the Old Testament that talked about owls and frogs being of the devil. And so this was early 80s, so just coming off the 70s. So decor back then had a lot of wildlife, including owls and frogs. And they made us go through the house and get everything that had an owl or a frog on it: pictures, pillows, pieces of art, whatever. They piled it in the middle of the living room. We all had to dance around it and pray and sing in tongues while they cast the devil out of these inanimate objects. And then they smashed them with hammers and the fireplace poker and just smashed it all. Pictures. And we were almost done, and my mother looked at the items, and she looked at me and she said, where's your brother's piece of art? And one of the last things my brother made before he died was it was like a tree trunk with a frog made out of rocks on it, and then little grass and pebbles and a little stream. It was very cute, and I always kept it by my bedside after he died. I always kept it, and I was probably 16 when this happened, so I'd had it for 8 years. It meant a lot to me, and my mother said, where is that? And I said, Mom, that kid Ginger made that. That means so much to me. She said, I don't care, go get it. She made me go get it and bring it down and put it in the pile, and I was sobbing hysterically and begging her not to, and she just beat the crap out of it and smashed it to pieces. And then they cast the devil out of it, and then threw it all away. There was another situation where they did that with all of our records and tapes when they decided that secular music wasn't going to be allowed in the house. And so we had to bring all of our records and our tapes in a pile in the middle of the living room. And my father had been a DJ for many, many years. So when they would take records out of the playlist, he would give me a lot of them, a lot of the good ones. And so I collected them, and those meant a lot to me too, because they were from my father. And we had to put them all in a pile. And same thing, we had to dance around them, pray, hands in the air, and singing and in tongues and yelling in tongues while they cast the devil out of the records and smashed them to bits and then threw them all away. And so anything that they would get in their mind that was of the devil that was in the house, that was the practice that we had. It was very bizarre and very hurtful because they were smashing things that meant a lot to me. As I mentioned, there were beatings in the name of God with the paddles. And I could never rectify how all those beatings and all that anger paralleled to God's love. It just, they would use the scripture, spare the rod, spoil the child. And I'm doing this in the name of God, beating you in the name of God. But it just never set right with me. We weren't allowed to date. We weren't allowed to go to friends' houses. We didn't have friends over. We just lived in a bubble. Nothing secular, lived in a bubble. We also were not allowed to go to the doctor. So we didn't have proper medical care. And so if we were sick or injured, they would pray over us and cast the devil out of us. It's the devil that's making you sick. And so they'd lay their hands on us and cast the devil out of us, and you're healed. They really thought they had healing powers in their hands. And so they would heal us. There were a lot of times, I was very active. My outlet in growing up was sports. And so I played every sport I could. Every season was at least one sport. And so I was very active, and I got injured a fair amount, unfortunately. I was also a tomboy and climbed trees and, ran around outside. And so I would get injured. I stepped on nails that went through my feet one time. I got my head slammed in a van door once. But a perfect example of not being allowed to go to the doctor, when I was 17, I finally was allowed to go to a friend's house. She went to the Christian school, so I was finally allowed to go to her house. And we were running around outside. It was dark. And so there was a lot of pasture land, a lot of fields by her house. And so I was running, we were playing a game, and I was running breakneck speed. And I was fast. I was a track runner. So I was running really fast in the dark, didn't know there was a barbed wire fence, and I hit this barbed wire fence going full speed ahead. It ripped a gash in my leg, 9 to 10 inches long, in a check mark form. I looked like I had been branded by Nike. And it opened my leg up probably about a half an inch. And it was about a half an inch to an inch deep. So it cut through the muscle. It was very painful. I hopped and limped back to the house. My friend's parents called my parents and said, we'll take her to the ER. We'll meet you at the ER. My parents said, no, bring her home. And so they drove me home. They carried me in because I couldn't walk. And they left. And instead of being met with compassion and concern, my mother was angry, as always. Anytime I got hurt, she was angry. You're always getting hurt. You're always getting hurt. And it was an inconvenience to her. So they helped me upstairs and put me in bed. And my mom and stepdad came in, put their hands on my head and on my leg, and started praying in tongues and casting the devil out of me and my leg and healing me. They thought they were healing me. And then they went to bed, and they didn't take me to the ER. I was bleeding, oozing. I couldn't sleep all night. My leg was propped up, but I couldn't sleep all night. It was so painful. The next day I couldn't go to school because I couldn't walk, and it was just this wide open wound, a big wound. And I finally got taken to the ER about 27 hours after the accident because I guess they realized God wasn't going to heal that leg. And so I was taken to the ER, and the doctor came in and looked at my leg and said, we can't sew this up. This has been open too long. Like, all the skin is dead around it. Now, today there's skin grafts and things, but back then they couldn't sew it up. So they gave me a tetanus shot, gave me antibiotics. They cleaned it as much as they could, wrapped it up, and gave me more dressing and showed me how to change my dressing and sent me home. And so their abuse and neglect prolonged my healing by months. And God didn't heal my leg, it took months to heal. So that's just one example of many of God will heal and not receiving proper medical care for any of us kids when we're sick or injured, which is neglect, basically.
Well, you were finally able to move away from home and leave your parents' violent, homegrown cult behind. But leaving wasn't just a case of simply walking away, was it?
Not at all. Not at all. My mother, in all her beatings when I was younger, she used to beat me and choke me till I would black out. When I got older, the choking stopped, but the beating stepped up exponentially. And when I was 18, I had just turned 18 a few weeks before, my mother got angry at something minor, and lined up her tools, her beating tools on the bed, and brought me in the bedroom and proceeded to just, it was a brutal beating. All of them were brutal beatings, but she was exceptionally angry this day and used the paddles, used hangers, used belts, the buckle end of the belt, her hands, her fists, and there was no holds bar when my mom was beating me. It could be every part of my body, back. Uh, she'd start with the butt, but then she'd go to the back, the head, the legs, the arms, everything. And I had long hair, and so she would pull my hair. And this particular day, she was pulling my hair out, and she was just yanking me around with my hair and beating me. And she shoved me down, and I grazed my head on her bedpost. And then I landed on all fours, and she was just wailing me on my back and my head with whatever tool it was that she was using. And I remember being on all fours thinking, I am 18 years old. I have taken this for 18 years. Enough is enough. And so I got up on my knees and I hit her with she was behind me, but I hit her with my arms, and she kind of lost her balance. She didn't fall, but she lost her balance. And I hopped up and I ran out of her bedroom, and I ran through the living room to the front door. And my siblings were all sitting in the living room wide-eyed, and my mother was chasing me, grabbing. I could feel her grabbing at my hair. "You get back here. I'm not done with you. You get back here." And the second I ran out of the front door and hit the front yard, and she followed, there were people hanging Christmas lights and out in their front yards doing things. And her whole mood changed. My mom was a great actress, so she could turn it on and turn it off like that when she wanted to. And so we hit the front yard, and she's like, "Kendra, come back. I love you. I love you." And I kept running, and I ran and ran and ran. And I didn't know where I was running. It was very cold. I didn't have a jacket. It was wintertime. And I'm running out of the neighborhood, and I see my stepfather's car coming towards me. And so I stop running, and I slow down to a walk and, wipe the tears from my eyes. I don't want him to stop and question me, because then he would try to make me come home. And so I just acted like I was for a walk, and I smiled and waved, and he smiled and waved, and he went on home. And then as soon as he got out of sight, I started running again, because I knew it would only be a matter of minutes before he would come back and try to get me. And I hit the main road, and here he comes. And I had decided to walk to a convenience store that was about a mile from where I was at when my stepfather caught up to me. And he rolls down his window. He's rolling alongside me in his car, and he's like, "Come on, get back in the car. Let's go home and talk about this." And I was crying. I mean, I was a mess. Makeup smeared. My hair was, because my mom had pulled some of it out, and it was just a mess. And I was bruised and cut and welts everywhere. And I was just crying. I was a hysterical mess. And he was like, "Get in the car. Come on. We'll go talk about it. It's going to be okay." And I said, "No, I'm not getting in the car." And a cop saw us. And I guess the cop was like, "What is this old man doing with this girl?" And he pulled up and stopped us. And he said, "What's going on here?" And my father said, "Oh, she's upset. She's my stepdaughter. I'm just trying to get her to come home." And he looked at me and he said, "Do you want to go home?" I said, "No, I don't want to go home." And he said, "How old are you?" I said, 18. He looked at my stepfather and he said, "Is she 18?" He said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I can't make her go then." And so I went on to the convenience store and called my father, and my stepmother came to get me and took me home. And when I showed my father, when he got home from work, when I showed him my back and my legs and my arms, he was infuriated, absolutely infuriated. He had my stepmom take pictures, and he wanted to press charges. And I had decided, I thought about it, and I just said, I can't go through that process. I was so emotional as it was. I said, I don't want to deal with her. I'm never going back, so let's just leave it. And then after I graduated high school, I moved to New York City and started college and worked 3 jobs to get through college in Manhattan. And I was determined to leave all that trauma behind me and all that tragedy. So moving to New York was really the catalyst of leaving behind the cult. But I did not want to go back to my parents' church or my mother's church when I moved in with my father. But because I was raised so religiously and I had a lot of religious trauma, I felt like I needed to find a church. So I started testing different churches, and I had been working in a Christian bookstore in the mall, and I made a friend there, and she went to a church, a really big Baptist church, and so I started going with her to church. And my first Sunday there, after the church service, it was a huge church. An older woman, probably early 80s, came up to me and said, "Are you a?" And she used my mom's maiden name. "Are you a?" My mom and my grandfather and their name, their last name. And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Are you Jeannie's daughter?" And Jeannie is my mother. I said, "Yes, I am." I thought, how strange. Like I didn't know anyone at that church other than my friend. And she said, your grandfather used to be the pastor of this church. And we loved him and his wife so much. It was a long time ago, but I was in shock. I knew that he pastored churches and they were school teachers and they moved a lot, and he would find a church to pastor. But I had no idea they ever lived in my town and was a pastor at that church. And it really blew me away. I thought, wow, I really don't know my family very well. But when I moved to New York, I still felt like I needed to find a church. So I was trying different churches and just really working through my religious trauma, which even to this day, I have triggers in religious trauma, and it's tough for me. I'm working on healing through that. But so for a number of years, I tried different churches and tried to find a church. And then as I've mentioned before, I came out as gay. I realized I was gay in New York after living there for a while. And that was very difficult for me because of being raised so religiously. I thought I was going to hell. And so for several years, even with my first girlfriend, she was raised Catholic. We would read the Bible and go through scriptures trying to find where it says I'm going to hell. Because, I've heard this, being gay, you're going to hell. And I've heard it in churches. So I'm trying to find it in the Bible or trying to find proof that I won't be going to hell. And for a few years, it was really difficult for me to leave the religion behind and also come to the realization that I'm not going to hell, if there is a hell. I'm a good person. If I'm made in the eyes of God, then why would I be going to hell? So it took me time to process that and work through it, but I just finally decided if there's a hell, I'm not going to it. But even to this day, there are triggers for me with church and the Bible and God. So I've definitely morphed my views and changed my views from what it was when I was in the cult with my family. But, I still hold on to certain kinds of beliefs, but not organized religion.
Leaving something as all-consuming as a cult takes its toll. Kendra, what was the aftermath of leaving home and your family's religion, and how long did it take to heal from the religious trauma you suffered?
I think I'm still healing from all kinds of trauma, from a lifetime of trauma. But I find today that some of the things that trigger me the most are religion. And when religion comes up, my mother's still alive. She's in a nursing home. But my father is also still alive, and he's high functioning. He's 79. He's an amazing guy. But he and his wife, they don't go to church anymore because they're older, but every Sunday they watch church on TV. And so there's still a lot of my family, cousins, aunts, uncles that go to church, not the cult. My stepfather has passed away, unfortunately, and my mother just doesn't have the cognitive ability to even think about religion, but she's still very angry. And so I still get exposed when I go back to Oklahoma to see my family. I still get exposed to church some. And when I hear that church, when I'm up in my bedroom at my father's house and I hear the church, it definitely triggers me. But when I first left, because we were so sheltered and we weren't allowed to associate with people from outside of our religion, and we weren't exposed to anything in the real world. I think all four of us kids, when we left home, we had quite a bit of culture shock. And, I went from one end of the spectrum to the other, Oklahoma and a cult, all the way to New York City. And but I loved it. When I got to New York, I loved it and I fit right in. That wasn't an adjustment for me. After 8 years in New York City, I'd had enough of the cold weather. So I left and moved to LA for the first time. And I've moved a lot for my career. But there were lots of things that I had to learn because I wasn't exposed to them. I didn't even date growing up until I moved into my father's house, and then I dated some. But really getting to New York City and understanding how to be an adult, understanding how to make doctor's appointments because we weren't allowed to go to the doctor. My first gynecologist appointment wasn't until I was probably 21 or 22, and my best friend from college had to make the appointment and take me. I didn't even know what a gynecologist was because we just weren't allowed to go to the doctor. And so it was such a learning curve. Everything was a learning curve for me. But I did it, and I was very happy. And then, of course, leaving New York and moving to LA was just an incredible experience. I love LA. I love New York. They're very different cities. But trying to overcome the religious trauma, especially coming out as gay. And then when I didn't come out to my family for a number of years. And when I finally did, I was probably 26 or 27. And there was this whole process that I had to go through again with my family of them telling me, you're going to hell. And my father, every time we talk on the phone for many years, we'd end the conversation with, I love you. And he'd say, find a church. And so it was still in my face when I was in Oklahoma or around my family. And, they've accepted me. My father loves me very much, and he's accepted me, and we have a pretty good relationship. There's a little bit of a strain there, but we're very, very much alike. But we've really healed a lot, and so I've healed with my family. I've healed myself. But about 6 years ago, I hit a wall, and I mentioned that before, but I hit this wall of I've got to stop this cycle of trauma and tragedy. And so when I decided I'd been working on healing my body for so long because all that I had been through with being poisoned and developing Graves and then cancer and going through chemo, which just wrecks your body. So I'd been focusing on healing my body, and I call it chasing the pain. I had so much physical pain, so much fatigue, and always just had health issues because I was poisoned. And so I saw so many doctors and so many treatments to heal my body, but I never really focused on healing my heart or my mind or my soul from all the trauma I had been through from childhood and my mother and the cult and losing my brother and being with him when he died. And then my wife, my ex-wife, and her crystal meth addiction and her beating me, and all that crazy 6 years, and then dealing with this company that was involved in organized crime and then trying to kill me. It was just too much. And so when I hit that wall 6 years ago, I really focused on modalities and studies and books and classes that could help heal me and help me move from just being a survivor of all these things into a life of thriving and finding peace and happiness and joy. And it's still work I do every day, but there are a number of different things I've done to heal. But I would say a couple of the highlights of it, and I expand more in the book, but not everything is even in the book. But a couple of the highlights is I'm a firm believer that you can't get stuck. You can't get stuck in blame or in self-pity or woe is me. And I always lived by that. I was never someone to say, I'm this way because my mother, I do not let my experiences define me. I define me. And so I also, you can't get stuck in anger or fear or toxic situations and relationships. And I definitely did that. I was stuck in anger for a long time. I definitely blamed the people that tried to kill me on all my illnesses, for sure. But I never felt sorry for myself. I just charged ahead. But I certainly got stuck in toxic situations and relationships. But I've learned, it took me a number of years, 18 years with my mother, and then 6 with my wife, and 3 with that company. So my time frame for staying in toxic situations got narrower. And now I'm very quick to remove negative energy or toxic people from my life. I just can't have that because when you're in those toxic situations, you cannot heal and you can't move into healing and thriving and happiness and peace. Something else that I practice that I believe very firmly in is practicing gratitude, being grateful for, I was always grateful for my career and my success, and I never took that for granted, but also being grateful for everything in my life. So I really ramped that up. And practicing gratitude, this is science. It releases serotonin and endorphins, and it creates new neural pathways. So the more you practice gratitude, the more your brain heals, and you release that serotonin and that dopamine, and it's very healing. So I encourage anyone who's working through healing. Sometimes when you're working through your healing or you're in a toxic situation, it's hard to find things to be grateful for. But you've got to dig in, and that's when you even need to practice it even more. But find the things to be grateful for every day. And there's a number of different ways you can practice gratitude. But I would encourage you, if you're not practicing gratitude, to start today. The other thing, two other things that I had to do. One is that I had to start letting my walls down and letting people in and letting love in, because for so many years I lived in fear. After I was almost killed, I shut down and I didn't let anyone in my home. I didn't make new friends. I took a new job and I moved with this new company, but I'd moved to a new city. I wouldn't make new friends. I shut down my social media. I got the best camera systems and alarm systems in my home. I always looked over my shoulder, kept all my doors and windows locked. I just lived in fear for so many years. And when I hit that wall, I knew one of the things that I had to do to help me heal was I needed to let my walls down and let people in and let love in. So I work at that. And I've come a long way. The other thing that I started practicing was forgiveness. Forgiveness for all those that hurt me. And there have been so many. And I'm not 100% there yet. I continue to work at it, but also forgiveness for myself for what happened to my brother. I had decades of guilt and shame over what happened to my brother. And so I'm definitely not 100% there yet, but again, I work at it and talking through it. Every time I do an interview or I do a public speaking and I talk through that situation, because I never talked about it before until I wrote the book and published the book. And now I've started this public speaking platform. And so it's forced me to talk about my brother, and it's very healing. It's very healing to share that story. And I think a lot of people can relate to many of the things I've been through, probably not having your employer try to murder you, but a lot of the other things. And so hopefully that's giving comfort to people. And I've gotten a lot of positive feedback about, thank you for sharing your story. I don't feel so alone, and I'm taking some of your practices and putting them into play, and it's really helping me. So it's just been an incredible journey. And I used to have, right after my brother died, I started having night terrors, terrible night terrors that lasted my whole life. I would run out of my home in my sleep. I would run out of my hotel rooms in my sleep. I'd wake up in strange places, and I was always running from someone trying to kill me. So they were very frightening. I'd wake up breathing heavy and sweating, and sometimes not sure where I'm at. And I dealt with that for decades. And since I've started my healing process for the last 5.5 years, my night terrors have diminished probably 95%. I might have one every other month or so now. So it's incredible practicing all these things and all these different modalities to focus on healing my mind and my heart. I've just made incredible strides. So I encourage anyone that's going through trauma or tragedy or heartbreak or loss, you really got to focus on healing your heart and your soul and your mind and getting out of those toxic situations.
Well, you're in a much better place in your life now and have written a memoir, I Can't Believe I'm Not Dead, and have given many talks about your experiences. So, what events or projects are coming up that you can tell us about?
I've got some really exciting things. I am leaving right after this interview. I am leaving to head to San Diego to speak in the IVAT conference. It's the Institute of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. And so they've given me an hour to share my story and talk about my path to healing. So I'm very excited for that. My publisher is actually going to meet me there, and she's bringing her daughter. Her daughter wants to be a therapist, so she thought it would be good for her to attend this conference. So my publisher's already there, and she's there to support me. And she's going to record me, and she's going to help hand out. We've got handouts that we're going to provide. So she's just been so supportive and incredible, and I'm really grateful. April O'Leary from O'Leary Publishing. So she's become a good friend and is just very, very helpful and full of great ideas. So I'll be at IVAT all week. I'll be working during the day, but then attending some sessions, and then I speak on Wednesday. So getting things like that lined up. I talked last week. I was in Dallas and spoke to someone who invited me to speak at their conference. So we're working on those details. So I'm really just focused on this platform of public speaking and sharing my story, because when I wrote the book, I thought that's great, and it was so healing, but I didn't feel like it was enough. I needed to do more. And so I hired a consultant to help me establish this platform for public speaking and establish a company. And so now it's taken off. And I had, as I mentioned, I had an hour and a half call yesterday with a production company who produces TVs and shows, TV shows and movies for a streaming service. And so I'm going to meet them in person Friday, and they have all these incredible ideas. They're very excited. They want to partner and do some TV series shows for this streaming service, and then even move into movies. So we'll see. They've got a lot of great ideas. We're going to sit down and hash them out and see where it goes. But I feel like I've lived this life and survived so much, and I'm still alive. And so I'm very grateful for that. But I feel like it's my responsibility to share my story and share my path to healing so that it will help people. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Well, it's been great catching up with you, Kendra, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to return to the show today. As before, I will leave links to your website, social media, and book in the description below. And who knows, maybe we'll see you again on the show in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm very grateful for the time that I got to spend with you and your audience, and very thankful and honored. And I'd just like to leave one last thought for your viewers. You don't have to just survive the things you've been through. You can learn to thrive, and you can heal, and you can find peace and happiness. So thank you, Mark.